everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today we have a new poll out of Emerson College polling to talk about, and that is for the 2026 Michigan Democratic Senate primary, in a race that is very close and really starting to heat up in the last few weeks. So let's get this started. The first news we have for this race is that in the new Emerson College poll, we see that of a survey of Michigan likely primary voters find that 24% support Abdul El-Sayed and Mallory McMorrow in the August 2026 Democratic U.S. Senate primary, while only 13% support Haley Stevens. Still, roughly 36% of Democratic voters are considered undecided. Support for El-Sayed has increased roughly 8 points since the January Emerson College poll, going from 16% up to 24%. While Mallory McMorrow's support has also increased by only 2 points, up from 22 to 24%, while support for Haley Stevens has gone down a pretty significant amount, from 17% down to 13%, overall a decrease of 4 points. It's also worth noting that roughly 2% from the 38% in January, now down to 36% for undecided. So 2% of voters seem to have made up their mind. But the consensus overall here is there is still a large amount of undecided vote left. Quote, there are generational differences in the Michigan Democratic Senate primary for voters under 40. Voters under 40 support El-Sayed over McMorrow by a 17-point margin, 35 to 18. While voters over 50 support McMorrow over El-Sayed by a 12-point margin, 29 to 17, while 13% support Stevens, said the executive director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball. The poll also goes into specifics on the Democratic governor primary race as well, while 52% support Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson to support Governor Gretchen Whitmer, while 5% support Chris Swanson. On the Republican side of things, 21% support Perry Johnson, 20% support John James, and 10% Mike Cox. On the Republican primary for Senate, 55% support Mike Rogers, 38% are currently undecided. Not really too much surprise Mike Rogers has that primary locked up. At the pollster, Emerson was conducted between April 11th and 13th with a sample of 971 likely Michigan primary voters with a margin of error of roughly 3.1%. Now, these results are really interesting, and this is one of my favorite primaries to cover thus far for the 2026 cycle, because it is an absolutely just super close race between Abdul El-Sayed and Mallory McMorrow, who have quickly emerged as the two frontrunner candidates. We could look at the Decision Desk HQ site for this Democratic primary here. The placeholders in this race, obviously, we have McMorrow, we have Abdul El-Sayed, and Haley Stevens. And then the map, the way it's really gone since the race started out, back on April 23rd of 2025, McMorrow was leading 85, Haley Stevens was at 15, Abdul El-Sayed was at roughly about 9. Now, the race has gone back and forth several times recently throughout the last year or so, including we could look at right around October. McMorrow was slightly leading Abdul El-Sayed, 38 to 32. Haley Stevens was at 30. Now, for the last 6 months or so, Mallory McMorrow's had a pretty sizable lead over the rest of this race. Could look right around March even. McMorrow was at 61% chance to win. Abdul El-Sayed was at 23. Haley Stevens was at 20. But the last few weeks and even last few days have really changed things. On April 11th, which a little over a week ago, McMorrow had a 61% chance to win. Abdul El-Sayed at 31.3. Haley Stevens was at 12. Now the odds have shifted significantly. McMorrow is at 47.5% chance to win. Abdul El-Sayed's at 42.38. Haley Stevens is at 11.32. It's clear that even though McMorrow is still leading in this race and her odds surged last year, Abdul El-Sayed is the one currently surging in the polls right now, or in the markets right now. Abdul El-Sayed has the momentum on the Democratic primary. The question is going to be ultimately, is it enough to end up winning in a divided primary of McMorrow versus El-Sayed versus Haley Stevens? It's also going to be interesting because Haley Stevens is clearly in third place right now on the market odds to win, and that she probably is not going to be the Democratic nominee, but how much percent of the vote does she take in the Democratic primary? Does she take enough away from maybe McMorrow or Abdul El-Sayed to maybe help the other candidate in winning the potential primary? Including for what's going to be a very tough general election against the Republican nominee, Mike Rogers. Now, the Michigan Senate race for the general election is going to be very interesting because in 2024, we saw the Senate race only go for the Democrats by roughly about 0.3%. Elisa Slotkin getting 48.64%, Mike Rogers getting 48.3%. So Mike Rogers being the Republican candidate again, which, by the way, he definitely will be. He has his Republican primary essentially all but locked up, gives the Republicans a certain amount of floor support for a general election and gives the Republicans some optimism they may be able to win the race. Now, that being said, this was in 2024 with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. When Donald Trump won the state of Michigan on the presidential level, Trump won it, getting 49.73% of the vote. Looking at the Senate side of things now for 2024, Rogers only got 48.3% of the vote, so a good amount of voters that voted for Donald Trump ultimately decided to either not vote for Mike Rogers, either leaving that blank, or even some maybe voting for Elisa Slotkin. So now Mike Rogers running in a 2026 midterm environment that's going to be less Republican friendly than 2024, without Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, who is more popular in 2024 obviously than he is now, is going to present a certain obstacle that may help the Democrats in this race regardless. But this Democratic primary is not doing the Democrats really any favors in terms of how competitive it's going to be. But I love following this primary because of how close it's been so far in the race to ultimately see how this all goes. These are the three most notable candidates in this race. Rachel Howard's also running, but don't believe she's getting any considerable amount of support compared to these three. Another Democrat, Joe Tate, that was in this race dropped out when he quickly noticed that it became a three-way race between Abdul, McMorrow, and Stevens. The polling thus far on this race is incredibly, incredibly tight. The most recent polls, Data for Progress, which I do believe was sponsored by Zeteo and Dropsite News, had Stevens at 23, McMorrow 22, Abdul Sayed at 22, with 33% still undecided. Now, this Emerson poll, which has Abdul Sayed and McMorrow tied at 24, Stevens at 13, other 3%, and roughly had Travis Zollner at 3% and Rachel Howard with 0, 36% undecided. So, at this current point in time, there are a ton of voters in this primary that are undecided that are going to ultimately shift. Does this race go for Abdul Sayed, Mallory McMorrow, or Haley Stevens? Those 34-35% of voters undecided are the key here. We're seeing roughly an even split of vote amongst Abdul Sayed and Mallory McMorrow, while Haley Stevens is polling in third place behind the two of them. But there's more than enough undecided vote for any of these three candidates to ultimately catch fire and win in this race. So it's a really fascinating race that I'm watching very closely because it could go to any of the three candidates right now with the amount of undecided vote left out there. Though McMorrow and Abdul Sayed are clearly in the lead, it really could go to any of them. In terms of the trends of this race, Abdul Sayed seems to be the one that's gaining in the momentum in this race. The market odds showed that as well. The candidate that's had the most to lose thus far is clearly Haley Stevens. The first few polls she started out as the clear frontrunner in this race, but McMorrow seemed to take the lead away from her, and now Abdul Sayed is tied with McMorrow. So ultimately, it's a back and forth race that until the primary takes place, we're probably not going to have a clear idea on who the leader is here. But McMorrow Sayed really tied right now is very fascinating. McMorrow is very slight lead on the averages here of 0.2%. But with such amount of undecided vote left to go, it's really anyone's guess who's going to win this Democratic primary. As for the general election matchups with Mike Rogers, 3 out of the 4 prediction sites have it as a toss-up race to the White House, tilt for the Democrats, and there actually is a good amount of discrepancy between Rogers and the Democrats that are currently up. Against Haley Stevens, the Democrat Stevens is leading on average by about 1.9%, but still roughly 12.5% undecided, 44.7 to 42.8, though that is pretty typical when you're talking about a race in November and we're currently in April, that there's a good amount of undecided voters. But roughly about a 2-point lead. For Abdul Sayed versus Mike Rogers is the one leading, and by a pretty decent amount, 33.2%, 3.2% lead for Rogers. Rogers has 44.7, Abdul Sayed is 41.5. So for Abdul Sayed versus Mike Rogers, Rogers' support is up about 2 points from 42.8 to 44.7, while Haley Stevens is the one with 44.7. In this matchup, Abdul Sayed is at 41.5. So you've seen a lot of media pundits, both Democrats and independents, talking about them potentially being scared of Abdul Sayed being too much of a radical candidate that may turn off a lot of voters and give Mike Rogers a chance of winning. I read an article earlier today before this video. I'm doing prep for this video, that Abdul al-Sayed essentially rebuked all of that and saying that those electability comments aren't really real or they aren't factual. But the polling that's been done for the general election thus far, Mike Rogers does seem to be leading against Abdul al-Sayed. As for McMorrow versus Mike Rogers is narrowly leading, but by a much smaller margin than Abdul al-Sayed is. Rogers here is 44.1%, McMorrow is 43.3%, with a 0.8% lead for Rogers. Though again, it's important to mention, the undecideds are very key here. 12.6% undecided for the McMorrow-Rogers race, 13.8% undecided in the Rogers versus Abdul al-Sayed race. It's possible that yes, Rogers has a 3-point lead against Abdul al-Sayed, that those undecideds just ultimately break for Abdul al-Sayed anyway and give the Democrats a win in all three matchups, given how much of a Democratic midterm year it's expected to be for 2026. Though the early polling data does seem to suggest the Republicans' best chance of winning this race involves Abdul al-Sayed being the Democratic candidate. So it's a really fascinating dynamic underway right here that the Democratic candidate that's surging in the polls and markets right now is Abdul al-Sayed. Well, based on the early polling data we have, the candidate that gives the Democrats the lowest chance of winning appears to be Abdul al-Sayed as well. So it's a very interesting dynamic. Does this mean if Abdul al-Sayed is the nominee, the Republicans are automatically going to win? I just laid out for you. No, I don't think so, because there's still roughly about 14% of voters that are undecided. Rogers still getting 44.7%. We know on election night the Democrats are going to get more than 41.5%. We know the Republicans are going to get more than 44.7%. So this lead right now doesn't really mean too much in terms of what it is in April. If this is what the results were in, say, October, I would be more concerned for the Democrats at that point that Rogers is leading by 3 points over the Democratic nominee in the 2026 midterm. But what this ultimately all means is we're going to have to wait and see. But this is a very fascinating race underway on the Democratic primary. So between McMorrow, Abdul al-Sayed, and Haley Stevens, who's the favorite to win on the Democratic primary? A few weeks ago, I would have said Mallory McMorrow is favored to win by in between 1% and 5%. Could you say now Abdul al-Sayed is favored to win between 1% and 5%? You certainly could. I don't think there's really a scenario where Haley Stevens is the favorite right now, but with the amount of undecided vote, you can't really rule it out. It's really anyone's guess right now for whether it's McMorrow, al-Sayed, or Stevens, and I can't wait to see how it all unfolds. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you did, leave a comment below to tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video.